The IMF has been working on a plan since 2011 for financial repression as a tool to transfer your wealth to the government as a way out of the mess of overspending and overborrowing that the government has done in order to prevent the government's collapse and have citizens bear the financial burden instead. And we're going to go over that plan today. Ready? Let's dive in. All right, I will have this paper linked in the description below just in case you want to read it. I think it's about 40 or 50 pages, not too long here. And you can see the date on this paper is 2015. This is the updated one. They started this working on this plan, and the original version of this was put together in 2011. This is by Carmen Reinhardt and M. Bellens-Sprancia, I believe. Sorry if I butchered that. And what this mainly is talking about is, as you can see here, the liquidation of government debt. Basically, there is a problem with high public debt, and it results in default and restructuring, right? And so this whole paper is about a plan to use financial repression and inflation in order to bail the governments out of the mess that they've created. So I want to start off with a story so that you can really understand what's going on here. Imagine you want to go spend some money and you didn't earn enough this month to be able to spend that money. So you want to go spend $100 on a nice dinner out to eat. So you use your credit card. You borrow the money, right? Easy enough. Well, end of the month comes along and you didn't have enough to pay that back. And so what you end up doing is you're like, you know what? I've got an idea. If I borrow from this other credit card, I can use that to pay off my other credit card. And it works. And so you borrow from one credit card and you do a transfer and you pay off the old credit card. And now you've got another month before you have to pay off the new loan. Then you get an idea and you think, you know what? Since this works, I don't have to just roll over my old debt. I want to spend a little bit more this month. So why don't I take out a little extra? Instead of just taking out $100 from my new loan to pay off my $100 loan, I'll take out $200, pay off my old one, and then get to spend the extra $100. So this continues, and because you have an influence on, let's just say you have an influence on the interest rates. The credit card company is not controlling your interest rate here. Let's say you're controlling the interest rate because you've got influence with the families who run these credit cards. You can make them give you a better rate. So you go and you continue to do this over and over and over again, and gets to the point where you've racked up hundreds of thousands of dollars in credit card debt, and it doesn't matter to you. Why? Because every month you go get a new loan to pay off the old one. You've got a circle of credit card loans that you just keep on borrowing from, ever increasing amounts to pay off the old ones and to spend the extra. Now, this looks like a magic money machine, right? Like you could continue this in perpetuity and never actually have to incur any pain or losses as a result of having to pay off all of that debt and pay back all of that you've spent. And the reason why this seems like a perpetual money machine, like it would never come to an end, is because the spending capacity of an individual is fairly low compared to the amount of capital that there is out there. Over the course of a couple years, maybe you go from a couple $1,000s, a couple $100,000, a couple $1 million you borrowed, maybe even a couple $1 billion. You start buying crazy things all over the world, just spending money like an absolute madman. But it's really hard to spend more than that. Like, even if you had your entire life, it would be hard to spend hundreds of billions of dollars. It would just be very difficult to do so. There aren't that many things out there in order to spend all that money on, as an individual, of course. And also, you're limited to your lifetime as well. And given the amount that it's possible for a normal person to spend in this hypothetical situation here, there is plenty of capital in the world to continue lending to this person. You wouldn't have a problem where he's borrowed all the money in the world and you wouldn't be able to continue this game as long as, in the hypothetical rules. Now, take everything that I just said and apply this to the government. The government borrows money because it didn't make enough money from what it earned in taxes. It didn't make enough money to spend what it wanted to spend, so it borrowed some. And then when the time came to pay that money back, it didn't. It borrowed some extra. And not only did it borrow some to pay off the old debt, it borrowed a little bit more to continue to spend even more. And since this is the government we're talking about here, and they have the ability to create an infinite amount of programs, employ an infinite amount of people, and create an infinite number of bureaucracies, and create an infinite number of monetary black holes that they can pour trillions of dollars into, and it lasts longer than many people's lifetimes, right? So this has been going on for over 100 years since the national debt since the current system of our national debt was started in, I think, 1910 or 1920. And so when you get to this point, you realize that there is a limitation. The government has been able to do this for a long time, but at some point, the limitation becomes there's no money left to lend to the government. They still want to spend. They've got an infinite amount of things that they can spend the money on, but who's going to lend them the money? Because as an individual wanting to borrow an extra million, an extra 100 million, an extra billion, there's a lot more money than that in the world. But as a government, when you've been able to rack up $30 trillion in debt, and you're trying to continue to borrow in order to pay off all that debt as it matures, plus some, you run out of money to be lent to you. That was the problem that the government ran into in 2019 that caused the repo market to blow up. There was not enough cash in the system. Now, at that point, you have an option to, financial austerity, which is we have to balance the budgets. If we can't borrow at these low interest rates, the only way we can borrow at that point is to pay much higher interest rates. But you do the math real quick and realize if interest rates go up to the point where the free market would be willing to continue to lend because it ran out of money at these low interest rates, and they're saying, no, I need this cash more than I need that extra interest to loan it to you. If you raise the interest rate to the point where the free market is like, oh yeah, that's actually worth it. I'll give you my money for 10% or 20%. Then it becomes worth it. Well, suddenly the government is insolvent. They're bankrupt. They can't afford that. So the solution comes in, you enter the money printer. Instead of borrowing from people or institutions, you borrow from the money printer. And that's debt that never has to get paid back. It's not really debt because as you pay it back, it gets rolled over. And then all the profits that you pay on that interest that go to the Federal Reserve get swept back to the Treasury. So any debt, any federal government debt, any treasuries that the Federal Reserve owns, is basically interest-free debt to the federal government. So the Fed owns, I think, like $7 trillion worth of treasuries right now, and that's of the federal government's the national debt, of their $30 trillion worth of national debt, about 7 of that is owned by the Federal Reserve. So the amount of debt that the federal government has that they have to pay interest on really is only 23 trillion or so, less than the 30 trillion. But now you get to a point where all of that extra monetary creation and the fact that there's not going to be any resulting deflation as a result of that debt being paid off starts to push prices up. The monetary supply starts to grow very quickly. And before I explain why that's a problem, let's go back to the individual example. Let's say you as an individual, you've ended up borrowing $1 billion and now the creditors come knocking and they say, we're not going to play this game with you anymore. We actually want you to pay the money back. But you can't because you only make 50 grand a year. And so but you don't want to default. So what you do is you pull out a printer and you start counterfeiting dollars. You start printing off these dollars and mailing them back to your creditors. Now that seems like a win-win, right? The lenders, the credit card companies, they get their money paid back to them, but you don't have to actually pay it back. You're printing money for free. You're printing these $1 billion virtually out of nothing. You have to pay for the paper and the ink, but that's it. That's a much smaller amount than the $1 billion that you're paying back here. But what has happened the entire time that you've been spending all that money? The money supply has been expanding. You've been buying things, contributing new dollars into the economy. More dollars chasing the same amount of goods and services will bid up the prices. So you were able to spend that money initially at the lower prices. Now that new money has worked its way out through the economy, it went to the companies, and that money that went to the companies went to people who were employed at the companies and those paychecks, and then those people started spending that money. And as that money worked its way throughout the economy, Prices of goods and services went up because there was a monetary expansion without a corresponding increase in goods and services because you were borrowing at an extremely rapid pace, and so prices have gone up. So when these companies, the credit card companies, when you pay them back, you're not withdrawing money back out of the economy that you injected into it. What you're doing is creating new money to pay them back. So when they get this new money and then they go to spend it themselves, what they're doing is buying things at the inflated prices. What they realize that they didn't know before, because they didn't know you were counterfeiting the money to send it to them, you were paying them back with dollars that were worth less than the money that they lent you in the first place. That meant when they got those dollars, they couldn't buy as much as what they could have before. As a result of this, there was a literal wealth transfer from the credit card companies to you. Now let's go back to the government, which has been doing the exact same thing. They've been borrowing, and when it came time to pay back, and they couldn't, they printed to make up for it. And what did we see? The largest inflation that we've seen in 40 years. We are witnessing a transfer of wealth from individuals and businesses to the government. Now, people will look around and they'll wake up and they'll realize, hey, I need to do something in order to not get my savings stolen from me. So people are stopping saving as much. They're buying stocks, buying real estate, buying gold, buying Bitcoin, and eventually they're just going to start to buy stuff in order to say, I'd rather buy anything that can be bought because then at least I have something now and I don't have to wait until later to get it at a much higher cost. Get rid of these dollars because prices are going up so fast, meaning the value of the dollar is falling so fast that I want to get anything I can as long as that means I can get rid of these dollars. And that's where this plan from the IMF comes in, the plan for financial repression, because as soon as people start dumping the currency in order to escape the effects of inflation, they're escaping the effects of inflation, which is a wealth transfer from the individual to the state. That means the state doesn't get the actual transfer of wealth that they are planning on when they printed the money in the first place. And so the government then starts to put in tools in place that force people to keep their wealth in something that is losing them real wealth over time because it gives the government the ability to take that wealth. It's a transfer from the individual to the state to lighten the burden of the debt on the government. Things like forcing savings into low interest rates, things like forcing 401ks and pensions to invest in a certain way, a certain allocation to government bonds, even though the interest rates are low and below the rate of inflation. Things like potentially limiting the ability of citizens to transfer their wealth to other currencies, to buy other currencies with their money. Things like making it illegal to buy gold or buy things like Bitcoin, putting limits on the amount you can buy of stocks or real estate or other assets, putting in place price controls on things so that people cannot continue to sell things for higher and higher to compensate themselves for inflation, and corporations can't compensate themselves for inflation, but to continue to transfer that wealth to the state. And the reason why I brought up this IMF paper at the beginning is because I'm pointing out that none of this is a boogeyman, none of this is fringe, none of this is like voodoo conspiracy theory. This is the IMF talking about these things in a 50-page paper in 2011 and revising them in 2015, saying all of these are tools that governments should consider as a way to get out from under the debt load that they've accumulated for themselves, to not have to default, to not have to restructure. Just transfer the wealth from the citizens. And when they find out, make it illegal for them to do anything about it. So I highly encourage you to read this paper. Like I said, it's not that long, and I hope the explanation about what financial repression is and how it works out mechanistically from like the individual standpoint, borrowing the credit cards. I hope that explanation is helpful. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments section below. As always, I really appreciate you guys. Thank you so much for watching. Have a great day.